So I am joined today by Nadra Mansour, who is not only a contributor to ArabLit Quarterly magazine, but also a historian and PhD candidate at Princeton, where she is writing a dissertation on the transition between manuscript and print in Arabic language contexts. And I must say, so this was probably the most unexpected submission for the crime issue of ArabLit Quarterly, which is our summer 2020 issue. I suppose what we were mostly expecting was, murders and robberies and not devotional literature. So can you tell us about how, where the idea for submitting this to ALQ came about?
I don't remember the exact moment. I do remember that I wanted to submit to you before, which was when you had the C edition. There's a devotional litany by one of the same figures who I translated here. Let's just admire it for a second because it's so beautiful. And there are, I mean, as you said, there's mystery in here. There's horror, which I love. I reread the one this morning about the book and the skeleton. It's awesome. So I wanted to submit this Hizb al-Bahr in translation, but it's really long. It's like 10 minutes when you recite it. And it was this last year. And I don't know, I really don't think I had, even though it's the difference of a year, I don't think I had the confidence to do it. I don't know why. I just didn't. I DM'd you about it, and you were like, "Yeah, sure, send me something," and I never did it. And this one, I honestly don't know where the idea came from. I think it's just a very natural outgrowth of working with these texts. Devotional literature, never gets viewed as literature because people assume that it's for devotional purposes. And I always admire these. I mean, you can never translate the little tricks of Arabic and what it does to you when you read it, because you read it and you think that's so clever and this moves me and all these different, it does exactly what it's supposed to do. But for this particular mashup, because mashups are common, this isn't like I'm innovating anything. I think I had been reaching for Hizb al-Nasr in my own personal edition of it. Well, I have several editions, but I was given this, there's this Shaban, which is like, this Shaban comes like 15 days before Ramadan starts. And I went to this gathering and they printed their own little booklet and we read Hizb al-Nasr, and I loved the booklet so much because it fits into my pocket and my purse. You can put it in your sleeve, which is what people used to do. And I had been using it so often and I thought, oh, there's some wonderful lines in here. I wonder what it'd be like to take it and mash it up with, you know, al-Nasiri, which is also iconic because it was used against colonial powers and it was banned. And the story of its banning has so many different parallels with like liberation movements around the world. So yeah, that's where the idea I think might have come from, but I don't remember the exact inception.
Right, because it was itself a crime, a banned book.
Yeah, I guess so. I like banned, like chanted things because it's really hard to track them. And one story I like about like banned poetry was that the poet, Anna Akhmatova used to memorize the poems that she wrote during the Russian purges because she realized that people were going through her things when she was out of the house. Mm. So, and her form just lended itself to memorization. Anyway, yeah.
So could you read for us from your mashup translation?
Okay. So for context, it's a mashup of al-Nasiri and Hizb al-Nasr. And Hizb al-Nasr is very well known because it's by Abu Hassan al-Shadili, who Imam al-Shadili founded the Shadili movement, or the Tariqa. And in the edition itself, you can see we use different colors to distinguish between what was once one and the other, but there's also a lot of like there's like a lot of connecting material that I didn't account for. So Let's see. Okay. Okay. It would be convenient, ideal even, if a pit would suddenly appear like the one we've been forced into. We tumbled in when our enemies dug it for us. I think sometimes that our enemies are like us. They can fall into pits. But I've learned that enemies are also different from us. They occupy land and bodies and minds. So for that, I want them to fall into a pit too, a pit that will suddenly and miraculously appear. I know that God can make it appear. I stand outstretched, my hands outstretched, my palms outstretched, my fingers stretched even further to you. God who is many things. So most importantly, God who is close to me, God who answers those who ask. I know you answered others before, you blessed them. They were prophets and I am not, but I can be something else. I will make you a deal. I'll ask these things of you, and in exchange, I will place a hope above a hope, but I can only do so if you let me. You will take my hardship from me and replace it with ease, a rush of wind, laced with victory. You'll draw a circle to contain that wind around me, and no enemy of mine will enjoy that breeze. And then I will cease to be in this pit. We will cease to be in this pit.
Wonderful. It's beautiful. So, so it has both sort of a use, right? And that's what people commonly think of it as, but it also has sort of an artistic, aesthetic integrity and beauty to it as well. So in these mashups, was it your innovation then to have them in different colors?
Not really. The colors was just so that me and the wonderful, your managing editor, right? Nashwa?
Yes.
Who worked on this with me. We just kept it in there to keep track. And then the file went to your art director, and it really works well with the visual identity that he worked out for it. I picked the color that they were in randomly, and then he used it to do things like this lovely representation of one of the descriptors of God. And then this is, again, another name of God, Allah. But it just worked out well.
Yeah. So you said, the mashup is a common way of bringing together different devotional texts?
In a word, yes. So what will happen a lot of times what I've seen happen before is people will be in the middle of reciting something and all of a sudden they'll recite another. So they'll be reciting one devotional text and they'll recite another. They'll weave in different aspects, but the devotional text itself is inherently intertextual because, and this is why I love them so much and I study them, I guess, in addition to using them, using them as a more passionate individual. So they tend to weave in the Quran, the Hadith, other texts into their fabric. So in order to read these, if you want to be able to pick up on these threads, there are commentaries that help you pick up on these threads, but oftentimes they allude to things that are, iconic verses in the Quran, iconic Hadith. There is a line in here where I talk about the others that God has blessed, and that's because they mention by name the prophets and their stories, and they incorporate them in, and they oftentimes you're asking God for blessings upon these prophets, and that's again part of the sort of intertextuality of these. So I was also echoing that as well, but because they're often sung, it's more fun to mix them in. So a really good example, and I can give the link to you and you can embed it if you wish, is there's a wonderful recording of the Burda by the Firdaus Ensemble. It's very hip, it's very contemporary, and it has a very joyous video that goes around it where they're just like touring. And it's the Burda, but in the middle they use al-Nasiri. And the first time I heard it, I remember just because the Burda has it has a rhythm, and different parts of it have different rhythms to them, and when you break that rhythm you can hear it, and just all of a sudden you're awoken. And I think that's part of the use of this technique often when they're chanted, is that it awakens you, and it keeps you, when you're engaged in these really long, like worship devotional sessions, these communal sessions, you're often very, like, they're long. I mean, they can be long, they can be several hours long. So when you look through the historical documentation of what happened at these things, and these are often guidebooks to sort of to help you conduct your own personal devotional night or a night with others, because it's often encouraged to do it at night. They'll include tips like have something sweet on hand. You can only have water of this temperature, and they're all practical tips. They're not meant to be like esoteric or weird. It's because you need to keep up the energy, but also to stay engaged.
So where is the overlap? Where does it come together with sort of poetic? Where is the relationship between sort of the practical and the poetic in this?
I think the relationship is that poetry is easier to memorize, and something with a rhyme is easier to memorize. So these are written, I mean, you can't tell it's not set in like a typical baked form, right? It doesn't have the columns. I mean, even in manuscripts, you have columns so it's in prosody, sajaa, like the Quran to some extent, and you can hear it when you read it, and it helps you memorize them. My personal favorite is Hizb al-Bahth, not Hizb al-Nasr, unfortunately. And I remember bits of it just because I listen to it so often, and because like it just stays somewhere in my brain because it has this rhythmic quality. So that producing a lovely rhyme, I think, is practical because like the Quran, it stays in your brain.
Right.
And oftentimes people couldn't, people could only sight read. So something like this was really useful. Like having a physical edition was useful if you could figure out the words, but you knew most of it by having heard it for so long. So oftentimes you have really large editions of these texts that are very clearly written out, so that way people could follow along if they were in a group. Another sort of practical-ish element is that I think for like devotion, you need something beautiful. There's this oft-cited phrase adapted from the Quran that, you know, God loves beautiful things. So people often think of religion as immaterial, but Islam has this very material aspect of it. I mean, it's a religion almost without props because you don't need all this. Allegedly, like Islam like makes itself out to be sometimes in certain discourses. It's just like, oh, you know, it can be so devoid of materialism, but I think it's a really material religion, and that's what I love about it.
So one last thing before, and this has been like really wonderful discussion, if we could just bring it back around to how you see its relationship to the rest of the magazine, to the crimes within.
Yeah, so I mean, I wrote this obviously during the pandemic, and I think it would be unfair of me to myself to say that it wasn't about all of the horrible things I saw happening by governments to their own people. And what I like about Hizb al-Nasr, which is the one with where I took the lines about the pit or the hole. I chose the word pit specifically because it's a reference to something else. It's a reference to, I was trying to weave in my own intertextuality, so it's a reference to the Prophet Yusuf and the fact that he's dropped into this cave or pit towards the beginning of the story. So that's an aside. But I remember when I messaged you about this, and I was like, hey, or I commented on your Twitter thread about this when you were promoting the submission cycle. I think I asked you, is occupation like something we can, is it a crime that we can include? And I knew you would say yes.
Right.
And I think that's where I wanted to sort of make my intervention, was what I like about sort of the pit metaphor is that there's often this onus on victims of crimes to be noble. And I like the fact that Hizb al-Nasr just says, you can not like your enemies. It was written during the Crusades, allegedly. So you can be angry, and it gives you permission to be angry. And I'm not inciting any violence in it, I hope, but like, you know, you can think, well, it gives you permission to want bad things to happen, and to want, not bad things, but to want a crime to go away, and to recognize that something bad is being done to you, which is often quite difficult. Yeah, I mean, I was also thinking a lot of the occupation of East Turkestan when I was writing this. I'm Palestinian. This definite, like, that's one of the reasons why Hizb al-Nasr and al-Nasiri speaks to me. So there was a lot of that in there. And I think I said that in the introduction, you know, my demons are all here.
Yes. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this. I really appreciate it. If you could turn the issue around one more time, that would be fantastic. Thank you.
I love it. It's so beautiful. Thank you so much for a beautiful issue.
Well, that has nothing to do with me, but thank you for being a part of it. That's all, Hassan. Thank you again.